It's fun to see where everybody is from. It looks like we have a lot of SLPs joining us and some AAC specialists and assistive technology specialists. So welcome everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started now. Okay, so I'm really happy that you're all here today. Today is kind of a rebranding of a presentation that I gave for SETC last year. And the original idea just came from a lot of networking conversations that I had with colleagues outside of my district. And they were kind of inquiring about our process and what we were doing in our district, our approach to AAC and core vocabulary implementation, and how we were doing it kind of at a district-wide level. And we've made a lot of growth, especially in the last 4 years in our district. We've been providing a lot of universal access to communication supports and training for staff. We're nowhere near done and definitely not perfect, but my hope is that if I share my journey with you, that it might inspire other people to do some of the same. Minimize this. Okay.
It looks like there's a question from Amy.
Oh, okay. Can you read it aloud? I can't see it.
I'm sorry, I clicked that on accident.
Oh, no problem. You're
welcome, Amy.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Sarah.
Good to hear your voice. All right, before we dive in too deep, I'll tell you just a little bit about me. So my name is Sara Ayars. I am an SLP by trade, and I'm starting my 4th year as an assistive technology coordinator. I've worked for Bellevue School District my whole career for 14 years, and primarily in self-contained classrooms, as well as in our inclusion settings. I support students age 3 to 21, and when I'm not at work, I'm home with my 2 sweet children and my 1 not so sweet puppy. Okay, so here are kind of the broad brush ideas that we'll go over today. I'm going to start with a very brief introduction to my district so you can just get a feel for Bellevue School District and what I personally identified as a need in the area of AAC while I was in my role as an SLP in the district. I'm going to highlight the importance of collaboration within and across disciplines. And then the majority of what we'll talk about today will be pretty much a step-by-step outline of the process that I've gone through so far to roll out greater AAC supports and implementation across our district. So with that, let me tell you a little bit about my district. Bellevue School District is home to about 20,000 students and almost 3,000 staff members, about half of whom are teachers. Our region includes 16 elementary schools, 5 middle schools, 4 high schools, and 1 transition program for students who are 18 to 21 years old. We have a Spanish and Mandarin dual language program, and we have Spanish immersion programs and several other choice schools as well. Around 100 languages are spoken in Bellevue School District, and about 40% of students speak a first language other than English. Many of our schools house different programs, and these include, but are not limited to, a Cascade program, which is for students learning to manage challenging behaviors. We have an Olympic program for some of our autistic students, a Pacific program that's very much a life skills functional program for our medically fragile children and for children who benefit from highly structured individualized learning programs. And then we have what we call our IPP schools, which are schools that are piloting an inclusion program where all learners are in their neighborhood school and primarily in their gen ed classrooms. So when I started in the district, and really until about 4 years ago, there was not a whole lot of robust AAC available for students. There really also wasn't much AAC coaching or training being done. Therapists would request AAC equipment, and then oftentimes you'd be given an iPod at first, and eventually iPad with Proloquo to go, or maybe single message buttons or mid-tech devices like communication builders and quick talkers. But it was very much, here's your equipment, now good luck. And the therapist would have to figure out how to use it and how to teach it. In my opinion, it was that adaptive or training piece that really wasn't there. So likewise, the SLPs weren't really training the teachers and the paraprofessionals either. A lot of the therapy was done, in the pull-out therapy office, perhaps, with very little co-teaching, very little push-in or follow-up and coaching. And the result of this was that teachers didn't always see or maybe understand the importance AAC devices would end up stacked on a table on the side of the room, or even, and I shudder to say this, but locked away in drawers. AAC was really seen as a highly specialized tier 3 support for only non-speaking students. And there were a lot of myths going around like, but he or she talks, so why would they need this? There were very few AAC supports in place for speaking students who could also have benefited from AAC. And these were the most common AAC supports that we had available, back then. There was a lot of PECs, especially in the preschool programs. In fact, funny story, one time a preschool teacher told me that the core fringe board that I was using with a student wasn't a good choice because he needed to learn how to initiate requests from a field of 1 before he could use more pictures. So that was kind of like the state of where our district was at. We did have some privately funded devices. We had some fringe boards and books of fringe photos. And then we had some like categorically organized communication books and things like that, but not a whole lot of robust AAC. And again, that adaptive piece was missing. So after working for our district for a while, and especially after I had the great fortune of working at Seattle Children's Hospital for a little bit, I realized that our district could really benefit greatly from kind of a systemic or a district-wide approach to AAC implementation. And my hope was that if we could do a better job of helping teachers and other educators understand the why of AAC implementation, then we might get greater buy-in. So in my head, I had this really big why, and I had a small but mighty team of SLPs with me who were also really passionate about AAC, but we really needed to broaden our scope and share this passion with the other educators in our district. So when I stepped into my role, I was the first SLP on our AT team, and I was given the opportunity to spend more time interacting with folks across the district, outside of my specific building that I had been in. So I started sharing my passion more widely, and I really started, training and collaborating with the larger SLP group so that those SLPs could then share the good word with all of their educators who they worked with in all the buildings across the district. But I found that it was also really important to get admin support and buy-in. So I always tried to include like the special ed directors and the principals wherever and whenever I could. Over time, I broadened my training and collaboration to also include, special ed teachers, paraeducators, motor therapists, and so on. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But eventually, I was given and also sought out opportunities to educate and train an even larger group. So that included MLL facilitators, the gen ed teachers, as many as I could, and even our broader teaching and learning community, which has like our curriculum developers, our instructional coaches, and so on. And that's kind of where I'm at right now. It's a work in progress, but I'm a really strong advocate for this collaboration because, as we all know, our work, especially in this area, can't be done in silos, and we have to really teach the other educators so that they are interested and engaged as well. And here's an email I received just last week. This came from an MLL curriculum developer that I had met at a teaching and learning meeting. And she's working on adding visual supports to math curriculum PowerPoints. And so she reached out to me and sent me this email to see if we could incorporate our core vocabulary boards into the math curriculum. I mean, like, so cool, so cool. So I'm very excited for this opportunity. And it just kind of highlights how making those connections and that collaboration across the district really will benefit all learners.
Hi, Sarah. That's so exciting. Can you just tell us what MLL stands for?
Oh, yes. Multi-language learners.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. Another piece worth mentioning regarding collaboration is that I found a lot of value in directly aligning our work with our district initiatives. Because then if admin especially can see how the direct ties to, for example, equity and inclusion, then they might be more willing to learn and work together once they see those direct connections. So for me, one avenue into this work was participating in district-wide Universal Design for Learning professional development with SETC's very own Rose Rasco, who also happens to work for Bellevue School District. And I was able to share how core vocabulary can be used to provide options for comprehension and language, as well as expression. And this helped open some eyes and ears about AAC, especially when viewed as more of a tier 1 or tier 2 support. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Okay, so we're going to dive in now to kind of the meat of this presentation. And I'm going to take you on a journey through exactly what I've done in Bellevue School District to roll out this more systematic approach to AAC implementation. So here's a map of my process so far. It's kind of similar to what you saw last year if you watched this similar presentation last year. And I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to talk in detail about each section, each number on here. But I do want to put a disclaimer out first because this map looks fairly linear, and I really want to emphasize that it is not a linear process at all. This is more of the reality of what it kind of looks like. Some components happen simultaneously, some start and then are revisited later, and so on. So I just want to put that out there. So the first step on our journey was establishing an AAC group. We started ours about 7 years ago, and how it started was very organic. There was a group of SLPs who were working with a lot of complex communicators. So we'd often just chat informally about challenging cases, and we found it was very helpful to learn from one another and to problem solve together. And because of the nature of this field of AAC and technology, we realized, it's always growing and changing. So there's a lot of value in sharing like recent journal articles and new learning, new technology that we found. So we decided to be really helpful if we met regularly. It's always been completely optional, and it still is. And in my opinion, I think the organic nature of our beginning was a strength because people chose to opt in. It wasn't required, and they joined simply because they wanted to learn. And I thought that piece of it is really valuable. So for the first 5 years, we had 3 volunteers offer to present. Someone would read and review a journal article, someone else would discuss a case study, and someone would introduce a topic for discussion. And then in the 2019-2020 school year, before the pandemic, instead of journal articles, we kind of loosened that, opened it up to more of a resource review. So it could be a journal article, but it could also be like a book or a therapy material or website or podcast, really anything that was relevant that people wanted to share. And we also added a component called a program tour, which was where an SLP would share about her building and, the makeup of the student population there and what AAC implementation looked like in that space. And I thought this was really cool because it was nice to see what other people were doing in their buildings. And then of course, last year, everything moved to the remote setting. The structure of the meeting stayed mostly the same with the exception of we stopped the program tour and we instead discussed a different robust AAC app in every meeting. So we talk about the features of each of the different apps. And then this year we ended up staying remote for these meetings as well, just because of convenience. And we kind of scaled it back to just 1 hour. And all we're focusing on this year is the case study, and that's like the meat of our group, but then also talking about a discussion topic of the year. And we narrowed it down to this based on some surveying of our group, and people really valued that collaboration and that case study learning experience. So the benefits to meeting as an AAC SLP group are really tremendous. The biggest, in my opinion, is that collaboration piece. Students with complex communication needs are complex, and it's really good to learn from other people. It's also been a safe place to kind of share the new research and resources, and it's become a great avenue for standardizing some of the AAC implementation approaches that we use district-wide too. Okay, so this takes us to the next place on our journey, which was the development of our Bellevue School District Core Vocabulary Board.
Sarah?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, before you move on to this one, there's a question about the case studies. Were they from your own students in your district or from somewhere else?
That's a good question. So we have people talk about their own students in their building. So sometimes it's a case that is really interesting and cool, like maybe someone using eye gaze and they want to share that, like the cool things that they're doing. And sometimes it's someone sharing a case because they need help and they're like, okay, this is the student, let me talk about him, let me show you some videos perhaps, and get any and all input and advice from the group. So it's always students in Bellevue School District.
Right, thank you.
Yeah, of course. So about 3 years ago, our AAC group was talking a lot about core vocabulary and the initial successes we were seeing with our students who had been using AAC systems that gave access to all of this flexible core vocabulary. And many of us were having a lot of success with classroom implementation using these low-tech core boards. It was sometimes the case that teachers kind of felt less intimidated, I think, to start using a new system when that technology piece was removed and they could just simply focus on the words that were there and modeling it, especially a board that was similar, for several students in their classroom. And so we decided as an AAC group that we could come up with kind of a standard board that could be used by the SLPs and teachers and students district-wide. Of course, we recognize that it would not be a one-size-fits-all for every single student, but instead kind of a first step for some. So here's just some helpful hints I'll pass on to you if you're interested in doing something similar. First, just make sure you include a variety of skin colors. Our initial board didn't have this, and so we ended up modifying it to better represent our student population. But I also recommend you have consistency across levels. We had a couple SLPs from schools make slightly different versions, and the symbols were maybe in a slightly different place, or for example, the preschool really wanted to have bathroom on the main page. And it's fine because the pictures are mostly in the same place, but it's sometimes a little bit challenging because students and teachers move across buildings. And so for the most part, the boards are the same. Like I said, it's not a huge deal, but it would definitely be easier if they were all exactly the same. Another hint is just to create different levels of boards with masking. We did do this and it's really useful for therapists because it's pre-made. They can just download, print it and go. They don't have to reinvent the wheel. And then my final piece of advice now that's different would be to consider using a board that's maybe a screenshot of a robust app like Colloquia Go or LAMP Boards for Life or Touch Chat or whatever it is that you're using. It just makes for an easier transition to that more robust app whenever you determine that that's needed, a tier 2 or 3 support for a student. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later on too. So here's just a quick example of what a masked or level board might look like. And as I mentioned, your AAC SLP group might agree upon a symbol set or a specific company board to use, especially one that looks like the AAC app that's most often used in your district. Many of the different app and software companies have their own versions of core boards, and sometimes even like those big, large boards that you can print for to make big core boards.
Sarah, can you go back to the masking real quick?
Yeah.
There's a question. With the masking, are you speaking about leveled board?
Yes, exactly. So we have, I can't remember if this one is a level 2 or something. So it's kind of similar to progressive language feature in Colloquia Go, where some of the buttons are hidden, but everything stays in the same place.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so next we'll chat about making files for distribution. So after coming up with our core board, I made a master file that could be easily distributed. And the master file had different board sizes. For example, traditional board or book sizes. I made mini ones. I made bigger legal size one. I made big tabloid size ones that you could enlarge and print. I also included example pages of fringe vocabulary that could be edited too. And our board was made in Board Maker. And so I made a digital version in Board Maker Player that I'll show you in a minute too, that also had voice output, although it's not great. But it also had like some simple navigation too. So teachers often will put it up on their smart board and model on the big board for the whole class, which is nice. And then I also enlisted the help of some colleagues to create a Mandarin translation and Spanish as well. And then last year, I made a virtual background that could be used in Teams. Thankfully, we don't have to do that as much this year since we're mostly back in person. Here's another helpful tip. Just keep the master file in each of these individual files in a shared location so that the SLPs and teachers can easily access them as needed. For me in our district, I put them all in 2 places. We have an SLP Teams page. We're a Microsoft district, so we use Microsoft Teams. Then I also put them in a district-facing SharePoint site that our AT team created. It's been really helpful because when people email me wanting these boards, I can just send them the link to where it is, and then they can pass that along to other people in the future as well. And in this image, you see 3 of the different sizes of boards that we have. The biggest one on the bottom there is actually like real big. You can't tell from the picture, but it's like a big core board. And then the middle one, I think, is like tabloid size. And the smallest one is 8.5 by 11. This is what the digital version of our board looks like. And I added some additional core and fringe vocabulary words that like I mentioned before, that you can navigate to on that bottom row. It was really helpful during remote learning, but it's also, like I mentioned, really good for whole class lessons because you can just put it up on the smart board. And we have tons of licenses right now for BoardMaker and BoardMaker Player. So teachers can easily put that on their computers. But there are also some companies that have software available for download. What you see here is Chat Editor for Saltillo, and then there's also like New Voice for Lampwords for Life, and so on. I also created some simple PDF files that had directions in them too. And this way, others who maybe are not SLPs or less familiar with AAC and core vocabulary could easily help with printing and making these boards and books, which leads me to my next point, that it's really helpful to think about creative ways that you can recruit other people to help in making these boards and books. I know everyone's overworked and tired, so it's helpful to recruit other people to help where possible. In our district, one of our SLPs who worked in our transitions program, so that's our 18 to 21-year-old students, they created a work group for the students. It was one option, but for some students in the transitions program, and their actual work was to print and laminate and create some AAC boards and books. That group's currently on pause right now because of the pandemic and everything going on, but it was really useful and helpful. They actually wanted more work. We didn't have enough work to get them, so it's kind of funny. But I've also used volunteers in the buildings and sometimes paraeducators as well. The most recent file that I'm working on now for distribution is a digital version within Proloquia Go, and this can be shared and accessed using either Dropbox or AirDrop. And we're rolling this out right now as a way to bridge our Tier 1 support, which is our Bellevue School District board, with our Tier 2 support, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, but it's Proloquia Go. And this could be helpful for students who have learned those motor plans on the BSD board, but who might now need more robust vocabulary and literacy supports. So a little bit more on this to come. Next up, we're going to talk about the creation of big core boards. Any questions so far before we go on to this one?
I don't see any in the chat, but feel free to feel free to ask if you have any, folks.
Yeah. I'll go back for a second. Make sure that no one has any questions. I know this is a lot of information. All right, moving on. So we created our Bellevue School District core vocabulary boards that were consistent for the most part and used across the district. So next we wanted to make them in those big sizes so that they could be used by teachers in that whole class setting, with the idea that a big core board would be helpful for all the students. And this was kind of the beginning of our shift from using AAC and core vocabulary only as that Tier 3 support, which is, the most specific support just for non-speaking students, and kind of opening it up to more of a Tier 1 or Tier 2 support, meaning that it would be available for all students. There's a ton of benefits or reasons why you should use big core boards. Overall, they provide visual input to support processing of our statements, our comments, our directions, and our questions. They also provide expressive and receptive language support, and they expand the length of our utterances, they expand our vocabulary, but they also require the educator, and in my mind, this is really important, they require the educator to slow down his or her rate of speech and focus on that key vocabulary. From my experience, I found that tying those big boards also into literacy is really helpful to get the buy-in, especially of like preschool, kindergarten, first grade teachers. And teachers love seeing that core words double also as sight words, and that the use of core board models, sentence building and early reading too. And the use of core boards provides peers with a model of how to use aided language stimulation with their peers. And I would say perhaps the most important is that use of these boards increases awareness and acceptance of augmentative and alternative forms of communication in general. So here are a few other sort of fringe benefits that I've noticed. Sometimes, as I mentioned before, teachers and paraprofessionals are more willing to model on low-tech boards because, like I said, taking away that technology piece makes it feels more manageable, I think, to learn how to model. It's also really quick and easy and inexpensive to use low-tech core boards as a first step to providing access to AAC because literally you find the file and you print it out. Sometimes you laminate it and then you're good to go. Sometimes the boards are already made for you. Finally, use of the classroom-wide core vocabulary boards means no gatekeeping. So students don't have to prove anything to get access to AAC. They don't have to prove, visual discrimination or initiation or the ability to recognize symbols or anything. It's just there, or it could just be there for everybody. And the boards are, in an ideal world, they're there in the classroom, they're already being used by everyone. And so that just means universal access for all the students, which aligns nicely with, presuming potential. And of course, we wanted to get these big boards into as many classrooms as possible, but this is often met with barriers. Some common ones being, I don't have a board, or I don't have time to make one, or I don't have the money to pay for it. So I just try and help teachers and SLPs break down those barriers if I can. So if we make the board for them, or maybe find somebody who will, then they can't say that they don't have one or that they don't have time to make one. So like I mentioned before, I think it's just really important to think creatively about who might be able to help make them too. And we were able to utilize our transitions work group, volunteers, paras. I made a ton. Actually, the photo here that you see is my deck one summer, just making, I think I made 20 big core boards, and other SLPs made a whole bunch as well. And thinking about the funding, again, trying to think outside of the box. I know budgets are tight, especially this year more than ever. We historically have submitted some grant proposals to our Bellevue School District, our Bellevue Schools Foundation to get grant money to pay for materials for the large boards. Some buildings have also tapped into PTSA funds. I worked at an inclusionary practices pilot school previously, and I wrote a grant to have the PTSA fund the materials to make 10 big core boards. And we distributed them to every preschool, kindergarten, and first grade and special ed class in the building. We also looked at budgets across the district and have tapped into any remaining funds, not just in the SLP and assistive tech budget, but also in our inclusionary practices pilot budget. We were able to tap into that to have some playground boards made too. Okay, any questions? I don't hear anything, so we'll keep chugging along here, but if you do have questions, please feel free to interrupt because I am not monitoring the chat right now. But the next step on our roadmap is training. So of course, what good will all these materials and things do if people don't know what they are, how to use them? So while we were developing the materials, we also kind of rolled out a systematic approach to our training. I started out by training our SLP group because I noticed when I was in the AT role that there's a huge variety across our district of people's comfort and knowledge in the area of AAC. And I wanted everyone to be up to speed on what is core vocabulary and best practices for implementation. So I started there, but then that led also to specific building trainings that were done either by the building SLP, if she was comfortable, or both of us together. We also trained specific groups such as paraeducators in some buildings and our OTPT group too. And finally, we offered district-wide trainings that were available for anyone to join, as well as some on-demand trainings based on the work in Project Core out of UNC Chapel Hill. And people can complete those for clock hours too. And here's a list of some of the AAC specific trainings that we do in Bellevue. We do a lot of AAC and core vocab, what I like to refer to as like 101. So it's just very general, explains, what is AAC, what is core vocabulary, why is it important? I often explain a bit about modeling or aided language stimulation and the importance of talking to students in this symbol language in order to teach them how to use it. As a follow-up, we do, what you could call AAC 102. So that just delves in a little bit deeper into other teaching strategies. I really like to talk about descriptive teaching. And I found that this is sometimes like that light bulb aha training for teachers. When they think about, for example, classroom specific vocabulary, like let's say adaptation or extinction, for example, thinking about those words through a core vocabulary lens can be really helpful for the teachers. So how could we use some sort of graphic organizer like the Freyer model or something, a bubble map to explain what is this vocabulary word, what is it not, and how do we use the words that are actually in this system to explain this core vocabulary word in the classroom. So teachers often leave with a greater understanding of the importance of asking open-ended questions and asking questions in a way that students who use AAC can answer. So again, I love to talk about descriptive teaching. As I mentioned in the previous slide, I also put together an on-demand class that was based on the work of Project Core. I really like to promote this training because all the work is done there and it's research-based. It's a really systematic approach to teaching literacy skills. I love their videos that they use and all the materials that they have there already available. And then new from the end of last year, we've been rolling out a series of short trainings, specifically targeting our functional life skills programs. And it's all around the work of Drs. Erickson and Copenhaver's book, Comprehensive Literacy for All, which I love. And one thing that's been really powerful about this training series is that we divided it into 4 or 5 really short targeted trainings, and each one was targeting a specific topic. So for example, we did one like on predictable chart writing or independent writing, alternative pencils, and things like that. And the teachers and paraprofessionals, they all come together, and it's been great to talk about this specific subject, just one thing, and then to dive in deep, with examples from the students that they know in their building. It really makes it more meaningful and relevant for the teachers. And then finally, the newest training series that we're just starting to roll out this year is going to be a year-long series starting at a few of our inclusion or IPP sites. And it's following the model like a master PAL work. And these trainings will be specifically geared to our para educators initially. And we're hopeful that they'll find them useful because they also will be very short and targeted, each time focusing on a strategy that they can practice and use hands-on. But I think what's going to be the most powerful with this training series is that it's not just going to be training itself. We're going to couple it with a coaching session. So it'll be, a short targeted training, but then let's do this with the classroom. Let's do it with a handful of students and let's coach and practice it in real time.
Sarah, I think that's such a great way to do that with the coaching session with it. There was a comment about the Project Core that you had shared how you made it eligible for clock hours, and I appreciated that.
Yes, yeah. So if anyone wants to see how we did that, sometimes it's helpful just to see what it looks like. I'm happy to share that as well. So basically we just took, I think, about 3 modules, and each of those 3 plus the work that goes with it counts as 1 hour. So again, if anyone else wants to see that, I'm happy to share.
Great. And then one more thing, there's a question about when do you provide training to paras?
Usually it comes from a request from the SLP or teachers in that building. But as far as like the actual time in the day to do it, that's the tricky part. So a lot of our paras, depending on the building, they have 30 minutes a week that's outside of their time with students that they meet with a teacher and cover a wide range of things. So sometimes we try and hop in on that like 30-minute time. Sometimes we can negotiate with admin to pay them for like an hour outside of their time. We have early release on Wednesdays, so sometimes Wednesdays are good for that. But yeah, the actual finding the time itself is hard. So I think that's why I really like the idea of coaching, especially for them, because it's training in real time with students too.
Then one more training question. How many trainings would you say is spent on doing the professional development?
How many training, can you say that again?
Yeah, Irene, if you're able to unmute, feel free to ask this question. So
Because I realized when you read it back how poorly I wrote it. I just wondered about how many trainings are you doing a year?
A year?
Yeah, because that finding time and getting out there to do it is difficult.
It is very difficult. I recognize that. I think it varies. I don't have like a hard and fast number. It's built into my position as AT coordinator. So I do a bunch of them. I do on average, probably 1 or 2 a week. It depends on the week, I guess. Like next week, for example, I have a whole bunch, but then there are some weeks that I don't have any. So it just depends. And actually that leads me into this next slide. But I really try and encourage other SLPs to do some of the trainings as well, just to build capacity.
Yeah, okay. Because we're doing, in our district, we're doing Project Core, like a training a month this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And I think that's especially nice because then you have the whole month to think about that and focus on what it is that you're learning, which is really important.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So like I said, that kind of leads us into this slide. So while I enjoy talking about AAC and it is built into my role, I really think it's important to include the building-based SLPs wherever it's possible. I know people appreciate hearing from someone that they know personally and they trust, and then they're also able to talk about specific students in their building. And then it also helps the SLP sometimes build her own confidence in the process. But one thing that I did in my role to support this was I put together a PowerPoint template. I actually have a couple of them with basic information on each of the topics that I showed in the last slide, or not all of them, but especially the AAC 101. And this way the building SLP could just take that template and modify it to work for their school instead of spending all that time putting together something new. So again, just breaking down those barriers. But I think, using Project Core, using a model like a MasterPal, any of those things that are already built, why reinvent the wheel and spend time doing that? So in addition to all of the more like traditional professional development, I also like to incorporate it throughout other avenues as well. So this year, I do several different things. I send out monthly what we call AAC Tech Talks, and these are just newsletters that focus on short, timely topics with a lot of links for more information. I try to start those now with a video link or a story by an AAC user, and that kind of grounds us in the work, and then ending with a shout out of a therapist or teacher in Bellevue who's doing something cool in AAC. I also send out email templates with information that SLPs can choose to edit or tweak on their own and send out in their building. So like in October, I did one on AAC awareness. And then in September, I did one explaining the purpose of how to use playground core boards. And SLPs like this too, because again, they don't always feel like they have time to do it or all the information to share on their own. Last year, I started doing some more short video clips that I could upload to our AT stream site, which is like our internal YouTube sort of. I really keep those short and sweet. They're typically more technical in nature. So for example, like how to screen share your iPad into a Teams meeting, or how to use Edpuzzle for asynchronous AAC coaching, and so on. And then we're also kind of dabbling now into this idea of office hours. So we're doing weekly AT and AAC office hours. So we usually have a topic of the day, and if no one comes, we record and use that time to make a short recording we can upload to our streams. But last week, a bunch of people came, so you just never know, but at least we're available at a certain time every week. Okay, so now we're going to, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, question for you about the newsletter. Did you start with certain groups besides SLPs when you're distributing your newsletter, or was it also opt-in?
I started with just SLPs, and mostly because I felt bad spamming like the whole district. And then I started including just teachers that have asked to opt in. And then actually just a couple months ago, my special ed director reached out to me and she said, I need you to send this to all of special ed. So we have been linking it. Again, those are up on our SharePoint site. So I put a link to that in our special ed newsletter. So I feel like I'm not spamming people quite as much, but then our teachers who do work in our functional life skills and inclusion programs, I send it out to all of them separately as well.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's talk a little bit about implementation. This is where it starts to get fun. Once some people have been trained and we have some boards made and whatnot, then we start to run with it. You'll hear this theme a lot, which is start small. You don't have to have every SLP or every teacher in every building doing it to begin with. I like to find a building or even an SLP who's interested and wants to run with it, and I start there, and then it gains momentum over time. And within a building, it can be helpful just to start with one teacher, one classroom, and then again, just building from there. So in this picture here, it's a preschool teacher in our district. She's leading a circle time using the big core board. It is often easiest to start with the preschool and kindergarten classrooms, but also keeping in mind too that the most, I'd say, beneficial training that you can do is that coaching in real time. So making sure that you do that. We'll talk about that more in a little bit too. Here's just a few implementation ideas. In one of my kinder classrooms, I'd often lead whole group shared reading activities with the big core board, and I'd model for the teacher how she could do it, as follow-up lessons. I sometimes created PowerPoints with books, and I'd put in the corner of the PowerPoint itself one or 1 to 3 symbols, and that would be a reference for the teacher, not for the students. And that way she could see what sorts of symbols I would point to on the board when I'd read the book. So she'd replicate it later on in the week. And then, in the beginning, she really referred a lot to those symbols that I put in there, and later she was doing it on her own. But it was just a really good way to reinforce that the core word that is modeled on each page doesn't have to be the exact word that's in the book. I think sometimes teachers have a hard time with that at first. So for example, last year reading a book called Plant a Kiss, and the text on the page would say like planted a kiss. I'd put symbols like put in. So using that core vocabulary. Another suggestion is to implement core vocabulary in shared writing activities like predictable chart writing. For that same example with Plant a Kiss, we did a T chart. It wasn't exactly predictable chart writing, but we used the stem I like, and the students came up with ideas of what they each liked. And what you see in this photo is my colleague who's an SLP in the district, and she's co-teaching a predictable chart writing lesson. So these photos were taken in a kindergarten class with a really cool teacher who was new to inclusion, and she had a non-speaking student in her class using Prologue to Go. She was very nervous at the start of the year, the teacher, on how to do this. But we started small, and we just picked one target word, and we sat down together. We took a blank copy of her daily schedule, and then I had her come up with examples of how she could integrate just the word see into these different parts of her school day. So again, some of that coaching, it was really helpful. And the image on the left, you'll see there's the teacher, but also in the background is the building principal. So I would always invite her to things. She didn't always come. She often didn't, but it was really helpful again to collaborate with admin so that they could be invested in the work that we were doing. And then later it helped with funding big boards too. These pictures were taken in a PE class, and that was one of the teachers who was ready to run with me first. And so we jumped in. She put me as one of her stations in a PE lesson. So while the other stations were working on jump roping, at mine, we just were giving and following commands using the core board, and it was a lot of fun. And my target student thought it was hilarious. So one suggestion is just, again, to find a district-wide shared space where you can collect those implementation resources. So similar to where I put the big board, or excuse me, the templates for the different boards on our SLP team site and our SharePoint site. I also put different implementation ideas as well. Some teachers and SLPs in our district are also following along with the Practical AAC's Year of Core, which is where they offer a small selection of core words each month. And then, so what I do, I basically take Practical AAC's information and I curate it and send it out to everybody, or not to everybody, but to SLPs and some teachers who have opted in. And then some teachers and therapists really find it helpful to follow a plan like this because it's really structured. And so I find myself often recommending this as like a starting place, specifically for new teachers or teachers who have a classroom of students on different devices. So for example, last week I was working with a new SLP and a teacher in one of those functional life skills classrooms, and the teacher has 6 kids using AAC. I think 4 were using different varieties of Prologue to Go. 1 was using a district core board, and 1 was using touch chat. And the teacher was really overwhelmed and didn't know where to to start by, modeling on the different devices. There were some paraeducators in her classroom, but they're often busy with toileting or, managing behavior and whatnot. So we talked a lot about using a core word of the week approach and agreed that it would be helpful to highlight the core word in some way on each of the different systems, so either like shading the background slightly darker or putting a thicker border around the word, just a way to help cue the teacher and the para on how to model on each of the devices. And the teacher was very excited. She thought it would be helpful to streamline. And I was excited because I thought if I can just get her starting to use them and, putting her hands on the devices and looking at them, then she could go from there. One final implementation idea is to do something like a circle of friends. I've had a lot of fun with these. And it's when the SLP or teacher or AT specialist or somebody leads a lesson for a whole gen ed classroom and just explains, what is AAC, maybe what are expected and unexpected behaviors that peers can do when engaging with AAC and so on. And I usually bring in a bunch of devices and we break up into groups and the kids and the teachers can practice, answering and asking questions or making comments on the devices. And I found these to be super fun and supportive. I also have an SLP this year who really wants to expand this into an assembly. We can't do it this year because of COVID, but we're hoping that next year we could do some sort of school-wide assembly. And then one of my goals for this year is to create implementation materials that could be available for checkout through our AT lending library. I haven't really fleshed this idea out completely yet, but I'd like to, again, break down more of those lack of time barriers and just gather books and hard copies of materials that align with maybe specific core vocabulary words of the month and print them out, maybe put them in boxes and then have people check them out. And especially thinking for new therapists and new teachers, they could borrow them and then hopefully in the future, learn how to create activities like this and replicate it on their own down the line. Okay, so we're gonna talk next about coaching. This could be a whole training on its own too. So we're just gonna dip our toe in a little bit, but as we all know, coaching is very important and we all need it. In our district, my AT colleagues and I help coach other SLPs. And then the SLP group coaches special ed teachers, gen ed teachers, paras, families, and so on. Anyone who interacts with someone who uses AAC could benefit from coaching with both the technical aspects of the system, especially if it's high tech, but also the adaptive use of the system and strategies for teaching language. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is a big piece that I felt like was really missing or lacking in my earlier years in the district. Teachers didn't really know how to use the devices or that foundational understanding of why it was really important. So now I try to emphasize, especially for the SLPs with whom I work, that this is so important. This is a very key component. Yes, we need the equipment. We need the students to have specially designed instruction, but we also need the rest of the team on board or else it's not going to happen. So now that we're moving towards more of this specific language system first approach, which I'll talk about next, as an AT coordinator, I can spend a little bit less time assessing and evaluating and prescribing the exact perfect device from the start and more time coaching therapists and then helping therapists coach teachers and families to make sure that the devices are being used with fidelity. So what does this look like? Here's some examples. Again, starting small, that's one of my the biggest points that I emphasize. It doesn't have to be done with everyone right away, just getting a key player or two involved and kind of going from there. It's really helpful to utilize co-teaching. So that kindergarten teacher that I mentioned earlier, I would actually trade places with her for a shared reading activity once every week or once every other week. And I would teach the whole class using the big core board, and she would then model on my student's device. And that increased the teacher's confidence with modeling for her on the student's device, but it also, I modeled for her how to use the big core board in the reading activity with the whole class. And this teacher loved it. And she still tells people to this day how helpful that was. Another idea is to pick a specific skill for teachers or paras to practice over the week as homework. So in the past, when I was in a building, I used to create homework folders for each of my students, but the activity that I would write in there was often geared towards good communication partner implementation strategies that would then be replicated through the week. So for example, I might write an activity like read a book and model the word turn on the student's device every time you turn the page. It could be, that simple. And at first I did get a little bit of pushback from some folks because they were worried it was just one more thing and taking more data and all of that. But after a few weeks, they saw that it was very short and sweet and easy. And so they actually got a lot of good feedback that it was really helpful and targeted. And then other ideas for coaching could be utilizing, short asynchronous video clips and taking advantage of everything we learned during remote learning with Teams or Zoom calls for debriefing and coaching. And my personal next step in the area of coaching is to train the SLP group on what exactly coaching is and what co-teaching can look like. I think there are a lot of therapists out there who are interested in doing it, but they don't exactly know what to do. So I think it might be helpful to give the group an understanding of why it's important and the benefits of it, and then also having them practice doing it and giving concrete examples of what it can look like. So that's my next goal in the area of coaching. Okay, we're coming up to the end of the road here, but next up, we're going to talk a little bit more about this idea of a specific language system first approach to AAC implementation. So the first part of this process started, 7 years ago when we made that the AAC group and then our first core vocabulary board. And that board was kind of our original tier 1 support. So meaning that this was available for everyone to use across the district. Teachers could print small boards for every student in the class, and they could make some big boards for whole class modeling, as well as, putting up big boards in other places around the school buildings like playgrounds, cafeterias, and PE rooms, as you saw before. But as I mentioned earlier, getting the buy-in of admin and other key stakeholders was a really fundamental piece of this process too. And slightly side note here, but here's an example of our playground core boards in case you were interested. I know people always want to know, like, what exactly does it look like? And in our district, it's very simple and cheap. We don't have those big, sturdy outdoor boards. We just printed ours through Vistaprint, and they're just large vinyl boards. They have grommets in each corner, and they can be zip tied to the fence. They're super cheap. They're less than $50 each. They're really easy to put up and sadly just as easy to take down. For example, when schools closed due to a pandemic, I will say that most of them are starting to go back up again, which is really cool. But these playground boards make schools just more inclusive and accessible. I'd say even if students aren't using them all the time, it really does increase representation of AAC in the broader school community. In my opinion, the biggest reward for having core vocabulary boards readily available as tier 1 is the increased district-wide knowledge and awareness of AAC. I can't tell you the number of people, from teachers to paras and admin, curriculum developers, who have come up to me and asked me to tell them, what in the world are these picture boards? How do they help students? So, having them around just opens people's eyes to what is this? But the other big reward is removing that gatekeeping. So if they're used correctly, these boards can help all students. They can help students with unidentified disabilities, students who don't have AAC system yet, students who are learning how to read, and so on. But again, increased representation of AAC in our school community, I would say, is always a big plus. So something new this year is that we decided to select one of our robust apps, which is Proloqua to Go, to be our tier 2 support, which means for us, we might not give a license to every single student on their one-to-one device, though maybe sometime in the future that might happen. That would be really cool. But if we're going to give a student an iPad with a communication app, we're more likely to start with Proloqua to Go as opposed to another robust app. So you might be curious, how did we choose this app, all of the others? It was really hard. We have students in our district on Proloqua to Go, Touch Chat, LAMP, TD Snap, and more. But the main reason we chose this one is because we had the most licenses for it. Also, teachers and therapists have seen it more often, so they're already a little more familiar with this app than any others. It's also really easy to program, and teachers and therapists are more willing to model on this because they're more familiar, but also because it's organized categorically, so it just feels really comfortable, I'd say, for the adults. And as I mentioned before, it's changing the AT consultation process in our district. So if someone determines that a student would benefit from AAC, the student is a direct selector, we want to give them access to robust vocabulary and language and literacy. We often will just start here. And I could even just send this out to a skilled therapist to try. If she doesn't feel like she needs me to come out and meet the student first, that's okay. And with this change in the assessment process, we have more time then to spend on the coaching and the implementation and the training, like we talked about a little bit ago, that there's not enough time for training. So it feels easier for teachers to learn primarily this one app as opposed to like 4 different apps. We also purchase these with the volume discount. And so we can push them out even to teacher iPads for modeling purposes. So I do say this all with a big disclaimer. We do still have other apps and systems, and these would be what I'd consider like the tier 3 support. So this is where everything else lives. We have several other robust apps that we can consider for an iPad, but we also help families pursue funding for other dedicated devices and equipment. And some considerations for other robust apps might be, if the student is better able to find buttons if they're grouped together through meaningful relationships like in LAMP, or if someone benefits from predictive navigation like in Touch Chat with Word Power and so on. Okay, so this is where we're at now. We have our Bellevue School District Core Board as our tier 1 support. We have ProLoquo Go as our tier 2 support. So we're currently in the process of trying to determine the best way to bridge those 2 tiers. The questions I'm grappling with, is it best to use a layout in ProLoquo Go that matches the Bellevue School District Core Board? So how I picture this would be programming that template that mirrors our board and then sharing that vocab file out. That's what that top image looks like. But one issue with this in our district especially is because we put 14 symbols across, so the buttons become teeny tiny. So I'm also thinking, should we get some key guards? Would that be helpful? Or does it not matter? Maybe some kids are able to just slide right into ProLoquo Go. But then the other question is, maybe it's time to rethink our Bellevue School District board and instead start gradually changing our tier 1 support to a screenshot, maybe of like the 7x11 ProLoquo Go homepage, and making new big core boards for distribution. Those are just some of all the questions that we're grappling with. And the work is really never ending, which leads me to my next point, which is that it's time to reevaluate our process and make any necessary pivots. So with any good journey, you never arrive at your destination after one straight pathway. It's usually, there's several places along the road where you might stop and think about your journey and reevaluate. But as I mentioned, in my opinion, my biggest question right now is just trying to figure out in Bellevue, how do I bridge those tier 1, tier 2 supports? That decision, once we make it, could potentially impact all the other parts that I showed you on the journey. So it could change distribution of the boards. It could change our big core boards, our implementation slightly, although, the key foundational concepts would remain the same. But the journey is never simple or easy. And it definitely always keeps us on our toes, right? Which is what makes this fun and exciting. So that's all I have for you. I wanted to say thank you to all of you. This is my contact information if you want to reach out to me. But I'd also have 1 minute. If anyone has any quick questions, I'm happy to answer some questions as well.
Thank you, Sarah. There's a comment that those were really great examples of why you might choose a different app when you were talking about ProLoquo Go. And a question, do you have a document comparing and contrasting common apps?
I don't have a document, but what we did last year in our AAC group, I kind of mentioned we went through the different robust apps during each of our AAC meetings. And so we talked through them as a group and went through the different features. So I have like parts of PowerPoints, but I don't have one single document that compares the different apps, unfortunately. There might be something out there though.